Claire Dubois was only 23 when the war reached her doorstep. Her husband, Alain, had already vanished into the woods weeks earlier, answering the call of the resistance. He left behind a farewell note tucked under the cradle and a promise: "Protect our son, stay invisible." Since then, Claire had lived quietly in the small village of Vallon, doing what she could to avoid attention. She was a mother now, a widow in all but name, and her survival depended on silence. The Germans arrived without ceremony, commandeering the village's church as their base of operations. The officer in charge, Captain Klemper, set up routines: weekly rations, identity checks, and house inspections. Claire, with her newborn in a sling across her chest, drew little suspicion. Most of the soldiers looked past her. Just another peasant woman, exhausted and plain, pushing a pram through the narrow alleys. But Claire wasn't as invisible as she seemed. Alain had told her names, locations, contacts. Before he disappeared, he entrusted her with a single task. If anything ever happened to him, she must pass on the names of those collaborating with the Germans, especially the traitor among the villagers. But how? A week after the Germans took over the village, Claire was summoned to the rectory, now a military outpost, where officers frequently gathered to drink and review captured files. A local woman, known for her German fluency, had collapsed from illness, and Claire, fluent in both French and German, was asked to temporarily fill in as a translator. She was given access to the outpost twice a week. Inside those walls, she kept her eyes lowered and her mouth shut. But she listened. She memorized details, meeting times, supply routes, and the names of informants passed between officers like playing cards. No one paid much attention to the girl with the infant strapped to her back. That changed when she overheard the name of her husband, Alain Dubois. Confirmed resistance, target for elimination. Claire didn't flinch, didn't betray anything. But inside, something shifted. She knew the Nazis were planning a sweep, not just of the forest trails where Alain might be hiding, but of the entire valley. The officers mentioned a raid, 2 nights away. The words were clear: purge the village. Burn anything sympathetic. She had to warn someone, but any written message could be intercepted, and she couldn't leave without an excuse. That's when the idea came. That night, Claire stayed awake, stitching a strip of microfilm into the hem of her baby's cloth diaper. It was hidden deep in the folds, invisible unless someone tore it apart. The microfilm contained 3 names: local collaborators feeding intelligence to the Nazis, and 1 set of coordinates: the next target. The following morning, she walked to Madame Fournier's bakery. Fournier was known for her bread, but few knew she was also a courier for the resistance. Claire handed her the baby under the guise of asking for help while she visited the doctor. She whispered just 2 words before slipping away: change him. An hour later, the film was already on its way to the resistance cell in Montillac. Claire returned home and waited. She knew what would happen if the Germans found out. But she also knew this: the message would reach the fighters before the raid began. And the baby? He never cried once. The message reached Montillac before dusk. A resistance fighter named Luc received the film inside a folded linen scrap tucked in a flour sack, delivered by a girl no older than 14. Luc had trained himself to act slow, even when adrenaline surged. He unwrapped the cloth in the candlelit cellar, held the strip up to a magnifier, and read the 3 names: Bernard Leclerc, Camille Moreau, and Henri Valette. All villagers, all collaborators. Beneath them were crude coordinates. Claire's handwriting was shaky, but the numbers were unmistakable. The next SS raid would hit Vallon by nightfall tomorrow. Luc exhaled slowly. His orders were clear: protect civilian lives, secure intel, disrupt Nazi movement. He couldn't afford to second-guess the message. Claire had risked everything. Now it was his turn. By dawn, word had spread silently through the network. Runners on bicycles moved between safe houses. An evacuation plan was triggered, one that had been rehearsed for months but never deployed. The goal wasn't to fight. It was to vanish. Entire families would be escorted into the woods before nightfall. Children were to be paired with different adults, elderly with strong backs. No one would stay behind if it could be helped. Meanwhile, back in Vallon, Claire went about her routine as if nothing had changed. She swept her porch. She sold eggs to a soldier. She even made small talk with Captain Klemper's aide, who asked if her son was finally sleeping through the night. She nodded with a hollow smile. Inside, her heart pounded like a clock running out of time. At noon, Madame Fournier returned the child with no mention of the message, only a nod. Claire understood that silence. It meant the courier had succeeded. The film was gone, the truth was moving, but Claire's part wasn't over. That evening, she was called to the rectory again. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 officers stood near the entry table. One held a folder. The other watched her more closely than usual. They asked her about the bakery, about Fournier, about whether she'd seen anything strange. Claire answered, without hesitation. Only flour and bread, as always. The officer closed the folder without speaking. He told her she could leave. As she stepped outside, her legs trembled beneath her. She knew what that folder meant. Someone had talked. Someone had noticed the visit. Maybe they didn't know about the microfilm yet, but they suspected something. That night, as villagers quietly packed and moved, Claire stayed behind. It was her decision. She would not draw suspicion by fleeing. Her presence in the village was the last piece of camouflage the others needed. A single mother with a newborn could not simply disappear without raising alarms. She bathed her child, humming softly. She kept his hands warm. She wrapped him twice and kissed his forehead. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, more than 200 villagers had slipped into the forest trails under the cover of evening routines. Farmers tended livestock. Children were helping gather wood. By midnight, the village would be almost empty. And Claire? She sat by the fire with her son in her arms, eyes on the door. The officers would return. She didn't know when, but she knew they would. And when they did, she would be ready. The raid began at exactly 3:00 a.m. 3 trucks rolled into Vallon under blackout orders, their engines muffled, headlights off. 12 SS officers disembarked, in silence, each with an assignment. They moved like they were sweeping a nest of traitors, not a quiet farming village. Their orders were to detain males of fighting age, question women, search every home, and torch anything that seemed suspicious. But Vallon didn't behave like other villages they'd raided. House after house stood empty. Beds were cold. Fireplaces hadn't been lit. Livestock pens were left open, carts abandoned in the road. No screams, no running, no resistance, just stillness. Captain Klemper, furious and confused, shouted orders. His men fanned out and tore into homes. They found bread still on tables, water still warm in kettles, but no people. It was too organized to be panic. This wasn't fear, it was preparation. They were too late. Claire, however, had stayed. She remained in her modest stone cottage at the edge of the village, her baby bundled in her arms. She didn't run, didn't hide. She lit a single candle and sat in the front room, waiting. The knock came 10 minutes later. 2 soldiers entered without permission, rifles raised. Behind them stood Captain Klemper, his eyes scanning the room. Claire rose slowly, her baby cradled close to her chest. She didn't speak until they asked. "Where is everyone?" the captain demanded. "I don't know," she answered. "I was told to stay home." "By whom?" "No one. I stay because I have a child." He studied her face. Her answers were too calm, her tone too plain. But nothing in the room gave her away. No maps, no radios, no letters. Just a wooden cradle, a half-knitted sock, and a cup of milk that had gone untouched. Klemper's aide stepped forward and whispered something. Claire caught only one word. Fournier. The captain's face tightened. "Your child," he said flatly. "Let me see him." Claire hesitated, only for a moment. She loosened the blanket gently, revealing her baby's sleeping face. He stirred, gave a soft grunt, and then settled again. There was nothing to see, no notes, no stitches, no sign of anything hidden. But the pause had been just long enough. Klemper motioned for the soldiers to search the house. They overturned the bed, opened drawers, dumped flour onto the floor. One even checked inside the chimney. They found nothing. Claire sat down again, calmly rewrapping her child. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer excuses. Every second they spent searching her home was a second the villagers gained to get farther away. After 20 minutes, Klemper gave a final order. Burn the bakery. Arrest Fournier if found. And search the perimeter again. Then he turned to Claire. If I find out you're involved, I'll return, and you won't be holding that child when I do. He didn't wait for a reply. The men exited. The door slammed shut. Claire sat still for a long time. She knew the risk hadn't passed. They would dig. They would question. And eventually someone might talk. But for now, the message had worked. The village was gone, and the child, still asleep in her arms, hadn't made a sound the entire time. By morning, smoke from the bakery lingered over the village, and the German trucks rolled out with fewer answers than they'd expected. The raid had failed. There were no arrests, no gunfire, no confrontations, just vanished lives and burned bread. In the forest, just over a mile outside Vallon, the evacuees regrouped. Luc and 3 other resistance fighters stood watch while families settled along the dry ridge path. No tents, no fires, just whispered names and head counts. They had saved 218 people. It wasn't perfect. 2 elderly men had been left behind, one too frail to move, the other refusing to abandon his home. A few livestock were lost. But the mission, as defined, was a success. The message in the diaper had worked. Luc pulled Madame Fournier aside. "She stayed behind?" he asked. "Yes," the woman nodded grimly. "Said they wouldn't look as hard if someone was still inside. She knew what she was doing." Luc didn't speak for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and handed her a small metal pin. No insignia, no marking, just a resistance identifier. "If they catch her, she can't be linked to us." Fournier clutched it tightly. She knew that too. Meanwhile, back in Vallon, Claire spent the day cleaning. She returned everything the soldiers had moved, refolded linens, and swept away soot from her threshold. Her body worked on routine while her mind stayed focused. Any mistake now could unravel everything. Her story had to remain boring, predictable. At noon, a German officer returned, alone. He brought powdered milk and a small bag of sugar, claiming it was a gift for her cooperation. Claire accepted it without a word. She knew it wasn't kindness. It was a test. The officer asked if she needed anything. She said no. He lingered longer than necessary, watching her son. Then he finally left. 3 hours later, 2 soldiers came again, this time to question her neighbor, an old shoemaker who had known Claire since she was a child. She overheard him telling them that she had always been quiet, devoted to her baby, never left the village. No trouble at all. She knew what was happening. They were circling her. That night, Claire placed her child in the cradle and sat down at the kitchen table. She retrieved a folded paper from behind a loose stone near the hearth, her backup plan. It contained a second set of names. Less urgent, but still dangerous. She stared at the paper for a long time, wondering if it was already too risky. Then she tore it up. The first message had done what it needed to. The resistance now knew who the traitors were. Any more would only increase the chances of exposure. She had done her part. The next morning, Madame Fournier visited Claire for the first time since the raid. She brought bread and looked visibly shaken. "They know something," she whispered. "They're searching further down the valley." "Your name came up in a side remark." Claire asked no questions. She simply handed over a clean diaper and a new pair of baby socks. "Tell Luc I need 2 more days," she said softly. "Then I'll disappear." Fournier hesitated. "Are you sure?" Claire didn't answer. She just folded her hands. She knew the Germans wouldn't let this go forever, and she knew that when they returned again, it would no longer be with questions. 2 days was all she asked for. 2 days to tie up every loose thread, to make her exit seem natural, not strategic. Claire spent them quietly, deliberately. She bought bread from the same cart, walked the same route to fetch water. She even nodded politely to the German patrol when they passed her gate. But beneath that calm, every movement was calculation. She shredded old receipts, burned scraps of notes in the stove, and removed anything in her home that tied her to Alain or to the resistance. She dismantled the false bottom of the cradle, just in case someone thought to look. Even the child's clothing was rotated, worn thin ones replaced with plain woolens marked with faint ink stamps to look state-issued. She wanted no questions, no pattern, no reason for suspicion. On the second night, a coded message arrived via Madame Fournier. Safe house prepared in Roche Blanc. Departure route cleared by morning. Claire nodded. I'll leave before first light. But fate moved faster. Then her plan. That same evening, as she packed a cloth satchel with baby rations and a change of clothes, a knock came at the door. Not a soldier's knock, no rhythm, no force. Just a quiet, hesitant tap. She opened it to find a boy no older than 10. One of the orphans who often wandered near the square for scraps. He looked terrified. They're coming for you, he whispered. Claire dropped to one knee. Who told you? I heard the men talking. The ones in the rectory. One said, she's not just a mother. We check again tonight. They're coming. Soon. She pressed a coin into his hand and told him to go. No names, no questions. Just run. The moment the door closed, she moved with the speed of someone who had already rehearsed every second. The child was bundled. The satchel was strapped. She lifted the back panel in the kitchen and pulled out the exit plan Alain had prepared nearly 6 months ago. An escape tunnel that led into the base of the hill, masked by an old rabbit hutch outside. She hadn't touched it since he disappeared. Not until now. With the child pressed tightly against her, she crouched low, crawling through the narrow space. The tunnel smelled of old earth and damp linen, but it held. 10 minutes later, she emerged in the shadows behind her neighbor's barn. She crouched again, listening. Then she moved. Through narrow lanes, past abandoned sheds, across frozen fields, she kept going, always with her body between the child and the open world. She didn't pause until the last stone marker where Fournier had promised the runner would be waiting, and there he was. Luc. No words, just a firm nod and an outstretched hand. Claire passed the child to him first, then climbed onto the back of the cart. It was filled with sacks of grain and hay, camouflaged for checkpoints. Roche Blanc? She asked. Yes, it's secure. Did anyone else get caught? No. Your warning was enough. But they know you tipped them off. They're searching in sectors now. Claire looked down at her sleeping child, his lips slightly parted, his hands curled near his cheeks. Then this was the only way. Luc gave a quiet nod, flicked the reins, and the cart began to move. Behind them, Vallon was already fading into the dark. The journey to Roche Blanc took 6 hours, most of it in silence. Luc avoided the main roads, steering the horse-drawn cart through winding paths and forest ridges. The baby didn't cry once. Claire kept her hands over him, eyes scanning the darkness for movement, heart pounding with every sound in the trees. Roche Blanc wasn't a village. It was a ruin, an abandoned stone estate at the edge of a ravine, partially destroyed in the last war. Now it served as one of the Resistance's fallback shelters, unknown to the Germans and protected by terrain. Inside the cellar, candles flickered beside crates of dried food, jugs of water, and blankets stacked like fort walls. Claire stepped down from the cart slowly, her legs shaking from exhaustion. 2 Resistance members greeted her, Jacques, a former schoolteacher, and Elise, a medic with quick eyes and a quiet voice. They didn't ask questions. They simply took her child, gave her a seat, and brought water. You're safe here, Jacques said. No patrols within 10 kilometers. We keep a rotating watch. Claire didn't respond immediately. Her mind was still caught in the blur of flight, in the boy's warning, in the tunnel, in the farewell glance she never got to give her home. She finally asked, Do they know I escaped? Likely, Luc replied. The house was searched 20 minutes after we pulled out. Fournier confirmed it. Then they'll keep looking, Claire murmured. Luc nodded. But they won't find you here. And even if they do, you're not leaving alone this time. That night, Claire didn't sleep. She sat in the corner of the cellar, rocking her baby in slow, even motions. She knew the Germans weren't finished. They had failed in Vallon, but retaliation came in waves. And if they knew she was the leak, they'd punish anyone connected to her. The next morning, Elise brought her a bundle wrapped in cloth. 2 small tins of food, cloth diapers, and a simple dress that didn't look like it belonged to any region. We're making your trail harder to follow, she explained. New identity. New name. We'll move you again in 3 days. Claire looked down at the child in her arms, then back at the bundle. What's the name? She asked. Mariette Landry. From Nevers. Claire repeated it silently. A new life, wrapped in an unfamiliar name. Luc approached later that day with a list of updates. The collaborators from your message, Leclerc, Moreau, Vallette, they've vanished. Fled before we could reach them. But their names are on every list now. The resistance has spread it across 4 departments. Claire didn't smile, but there was relief in her eyes. What about the villagers? She asked. They're safe. Camped temporarily near Montelac. We'll rehome them as soon as we can. No casualties. She nodded once. That was enough. Before leaving, Luc set a paper on the table beside her. It was a rough sketch of Vallon, marked with circles and notes. This is what you saved. That raid was the beginning of something bigger. They wanted to erase that valley. You bought us time. We won't waste it. Claire touched the paper briefly, then folded it without a word. She didn't need recognition. She needed the war to end, and until then, she would do whatever was asked, no matter the cost. By the 3rd day in Roche Blanc, Claire was ready to move. Again. Her new identity, Mariette Landry, had been memorized down to the year of birth, region, and even a fabricated husband lost in an explosion at a munitions factory. Elise had crafted forged papers. Jacques had burned the originals. Claire wore the new name like armor, not because she believed in it, but because she had to. Luc returned with transport, a hay cart driven by a farmer who had memorized only 3 words, Nevers, Mariette, infant. Claire didn't ask his real name, and he didn't ask hers. Before leaving, she spoke to Jacques quietly. What happens if they catch me? Jacques didn't offer comfort. Then you'll say nothing. And we'll make sure someone else keeps speaking. Claire placed her child in a cloth sling, secured her satchel, and climbed into the cart without another word. The journey to Nevers took 2 days. They traveled at night, slept in barns, and passed through 2 checkpoints. At each one, Claire kept her eyes down and her hands resting calmly on the baby. No questions were asked. Her forged identity papers bore the stamp of a neutral zone administrator. The baby's documents simply read "No known father." When they finally arrived in Nevers, Claire didn't settle. The resistance had arranged for her to be placed with a sympathetic widow who ran a dress shop on a quiet street. The woman, Madame Charvet, greeted her with quiet understanding. She didn't ask for details. She showed Claire the attic, handed her a house key, and left a warm cloth for the baby. This place is clean, she said. No visitors. The Germans come by once a week for mending. That's all. Claire nodded. I can work. You can survive, Madame Charvet replied. For now, that's enough. In the weeks that followed, Claire stayed invisible. She cleaned, she mended dresses, she prepared milk and sewed tiny garments by hand. Each morning, she watched from the upstairs window as the soldiers passed below. She memorized faces, not out of fear, but instinct. One afternoon, a name surfaced in whispered conversation between customers. Fournier had been arrested. Claire didn't react, but the words hit like a blow to the stomach. No trial, no formal charge, just taken. Some said she had hidden things in her flour sacks. Others said she was too friendly with foreigners. Claire wanted to scream, to go back, to fix it, but she didn't move. The next day, she wrote her first coded message since the raid. It was stitched into the hem of a handkerchief, addressed to a contact in Bourges, sent under the pretense of a fabric shipment. The message was simple. Confirm. Status of Fournier. If alive, she must be freed. She saved over 200. She deserves to be saved too. That night, Claire didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, her child pressed against her chest, listening to every sound from the street below. She hadn't spoken her real name in nearly a month. She didn't miss it. She missed the people she couldn't protect. But she wasn't done. She would continue. Even if no one ever knew her face or story. Even if the war buried every name she used. Claire would keep sending messages. Because sometimes a whisper stitched into cloth could change the course of hundreds of lives. And sometimes, that was the only thing standing between silence and survival. The confirmation came 12 days later. Claire was arranging bolts of fabric on a shelf when Madame Charvet entered the shop with a red threaded envelope, one of the pre-arranged signals. Claire excused herself quietly and carried the envelope upstairs. Inside was a single line, written in Claire's own coded shorthand, Fournier alive, holding cell in Orléans, transfer pending. The room spun for a moment. Claire sat down beside her son, now nearly 5 months old, and reread the message twice. It wasn't just relief, it was urgency. A pending transfer meant the Germans hadn't decided what to do with her yet, but once they did, it would be final, either execution or deportation. There was no third option. By nightfall, Claire had already begun preparing her response. She used what she had: linen scraps, red thread, and a pattern catalog. In the margins of a design for a child's cloak, she embedded the message: courier needed for Orléans. Civilian extraction required. Identity: Fournier. Code yellow. The code yellow tag signified a civilian non-combatant who had directly assisted in a successful resistance operation. It was rare, and only a few had ever been rescued under it. The risk was high, but Claire insisted. She stitched the cloak herself, taking extra care with the lining. The courier arrived the next morning under the guise of picking up a custom order. Claire handed him the package, and with it, the fate of the woman who had once cradled her child without hesitation. For the next 5 days, there was no reply. Claire kept to her routine, working in the shop, feeding the baby, and keeping her head low. But every time the bell above the shop door rang, her breath caught. Every unfamiliar knock at night made her stomach twist. On the 6th day, just before closing, the bell rang again. It was Elise. She entered like any other customer, examining a bolt of navy wool while whispering under her breath. Extraction succeeded. Fournier secured. She's safe. Claire's hand stopped mid-fold. Elise didn't pause. No German casualties. Clean handoff. She's being moved to Montillac under protection. You saved her. Claire said nothing. She didn't have the words. She just nodded, then lowered her eyes and handed Elise a set of buttons wrapped in paper. Their transaction was over in seconds. After Elise left, Claire returned to the attic and allowed herself to sit quietly beside her son for the first time in days. He was beginning to smile now, even respond to her voice. There was something grounding in that. Something human in the middle of everything that wasn't. She whispered a single sentence to him. You saved a woman's life before you could even walk. He laughed at the sound of her voice. Claire stared at him, knowing that every message, every risk, every silent act stitched into cotton or carved into wood wasn't just for the resistance. It was for him, so that when he grew up, if he grew up, he would live in a world where mothers didn't have to hide names in diapers, and friends didn't vanish into black vans for baking bread. Her war wasn't over, but her message had reached, again, and in a war built on silence and fear, that was a victory. 2 weeks after Fournier's rescue, Claire was contacted again, but this time, not through thread or couriers. A man knocked on the dress shop door after hours. Madame Charvet answered, and from the attic window Claire recognized him immediately. He wasn't part of her usual network. His name was René Marchand, once a journalist, now an intelligence handler for regional resistance cells. He rarely surfaced in person. If he was here, it meant something significant had shifted. Madame Charvet escorted him upstairs without a word. René got to the point. They're rotating SS command near Vallon. New officers, more aggressive. They're purging paper trails. Conducting late arrests. We need the remaining safe houses cleared, all of them. Claire didn't blink. What's left there? 3 relay points. 1 codes archive, and 1 survivor. She looked up sharply. Survivor? René hesitated. A teenage boy. Stayed behind during the first evacuation. Hid in the cellars. He's been relaying movements to us for weeks through mirror flashes and pigeons. But his last signal was delayed. They're getting closer. Why? Hasn't he been moved? He refused. Said he'd stay as long as Claire Dubois was alive. The words landed like ice. Claire hadn't heard her real name spoken aloud in over a month. Not since she'd become Mariette Landry. Not since she'd vanished into the folds of false lives and paper identities. René continued. He's your husband's cousin. Adrian, 16. Claire sat down slowly, her arms instinctively wrapping around her child. "I'll go," she said after a pause. Renee didn't argue. "You leave tomorrow, dressed as a Red Cross nurse. You'll be accompanied by Elise. Once inside, your priority is Adrian. If caught, you're Mariette again. Speak only German. Say the child is sick and the boy is your assistant." Claire nodded. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the beams above her, listening to her son's soft breaths. She had buried her name, her story, even her voice to survive. But now, one thread from her past, one thread with a name, had tugged its way back. She couldn't leave it there. By morning, she was dressed in a starched uniform, a white armband marked with a red cross fastened neatly above her elbow. Elise gave her final instructions. "We only have a 2-hour window. After that, the guards rotate. If we're not out by then." "I understand," Claire cut in. They approached Vallon on foot, walking beside a borrowed ambulance cart drawn by a mule. The child slept, swaddled in a false fever wrap. Elise carried a satchel of medicine as cover. The village was colder than memory. Doors had been rehinged. Footsteps echoed. No warmth. No smoke. Claire didn't focus on that. Her eyes searched for a signal, something small, something easy to miss. Then she saw it. A piece of cloth fluttering from the cellar grate behind the old mayor's house. The exact signal they'd agreed on before the war scattered them. He was still alive. They moved quickly, speaking to no one, posing as relief volunteers conducting a child welfare sweep. No one questioned them. No one stopped them. Claire entered the cellar first. And there he was. Adrian looked older than 16. Thin, sharp-eyed, with a small pistol resting beside an oil lamp. When he saw Claire, he didn't speak. He only stepped forward and hugged her. She let him. For 1 second, she was Claire again. And then the moment passed. "It's time," she whispered. "We're going home." Adrian didn't ask questions. He simply packed what little he had. A map, 3 coated slips, and a small tin of dry rations, and followed Claire and Elise out of the cellar. They moved as planned, keeping their pace, steady and calm, heads down, posture professional. Elise walked ahead, pushing the cart that held Claire's sleeping baby. Claire stayed close beside Adrian, one hand on his shoulder, the other holding forged documents listing him as a field nurse trainee under the Red Cross. Their window was short. 2 guards were stationed at the village perimeter. Neither one looked too concerned. Relief workers had passed through before. Still, Elise did the talking. She explained the boy's role, the infant's fever, and their urgent return to Never for medical intervention. The guards barely glanced at the documents. One even peered into the cart, saw the baby's flushed cheeks, painted just an hour earlier with beet juice, and nodded them through. They didn't breathe until they were half a mile beyond the checkpoint. Once out of sight, they turned off the road and made their way into the trees where Luke waited with a second cart and 2 horses. He raised a hand in greeting, but the look in his eyes was all business. "Elise, you and Adrian ride together. Claire takes the child with me." They didn't argue. The group split and practiced silence, carts rolling in opposite directions to confuse any potential tales. Inside Luke's cart, Claire watched her child sleep for several minutes before speaking. "He risked everything," she said quietly. "Adrian?" She nodded. Luke kept his eyes on the road. "He passed 3 messages to us in the last month. Movement schedules, map corrections, the name of the officer who replaced Klemper. He gave us more than most grown men." Claire didn't reply. She was thinking of her husband, Alain, and whether he knew his cousin had become part of the same fight, whether he'd be proud, whether he was still alive at all. They reached Nevers just after dark. Adrian's arrival had already been arranged. He would take shelter at a farm safe house 3 kilometers out, disguised as a labor apprentice. Claire watched him go without ceremony, though his parting words stayed with her. "You didn't abandon your name," he said. "You just lent it to the war." Afterward, Claire returned to Madame Charvet's attic, washed the makeup from her child's face, and held him against her chest in the quiet. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she was asked to move, to risk, to disappear. Her identity wasn't just hidden, it had become fluid, passed between roles and faces like thread through a needle. But her cause remained the same. The resistance had already begun compiling what they called the silent ledger, a list of those who had changed the course of local operations through indirect means. Claire's name wouldn't appear on it, not officially, but everyone in the network knew the truth. The woman who sent a message in a diaper had turned an entire raid into a failed memory, and now with Adrian safe, that number had grown. One lives, not soldiers, not generals, just people who were still breathing because one mother dared to act, and she wasn't finished. Not yet. By March of the following year, the Germans began tightening their grip on central France. Every checkpoint became hostile. Every village saw more uniforms, more questions, more lists pinned to walls with names of the wanted and the missing. Resistance activity was escalating. Sabotaged trains, stolen supplies, intercepted radio frequencies. And with every act of defiance, the price of being caught grew steeper. Claire remained in Never, but her role had changed. She was no longer just a messenger. She was now a handler, trusted to receive incoming information, vet it, and decide which fragments were worth risking lives to deliver. Her attic became a sorting room. Hidden behind bolts of fabric and baskets of thread were envelopes, names, scraps of notes written on soap paper and cigarette paper. Some were real, some were traps. Claire learned to tell the difference. Her Simin-Chakra, baby now crawling, became part of her disguise. She brought him to the market twice a week, used his presence to avoid suspicion, to appear ordinary. No one expected the woman with the sleepy eyes and the child in a sling to be the reason 2 German trains never reached their destination. One night, Luc arrived unannounced. He entered the back of the shop while Madame Charvet kept watch at the front. Claire met him in the cellar. "We need you to go back to Vallon." She froze. "Why?" "There's a man hiding near the riverbed. He's been sending us coordinates. We believe he intercepted orders for a mass deportation from the outer villages. But he won't move. Says he needs confirmation the information's real before he exposes himself." Claire folded her arms. "You want me to be the confirmation? He'll only trust someone local, someone who lived through the last raid. He asked for you by name." That name again, Claire Dubois. She hadn't used it in over a year. It lived only in whispers, passed between resistance hands like a myth. But it still had power. She agreed. The journey back to Vallon was risky. The Germans had reinforced the southern routes. No carts this time, only footpaths. She left her child in Charvet's care, disguised as an orphan to protect them both. It was the hardest part, walking away without looking back. She traveled, through the woods, escorted by a courier who said nothing the entire way. They reached the river at midnight. A small fire flickered once, then vanished. A signal. Claire approached the edge and waited. The man emerged from the shadows slowly, rifle slung over his shoulder, beard thick, eyes red from lack of sleep. "Dubois?" he asked quietly. She nodded. He pulled a folded map from his coat. "These are the locations. Train scheduled for next Thursday. 6 villages, over 400 people." Claire scanned it, memorized the coordinates. "Why now?" "I had to be sure it wasn't bait. They're trying to break the resistance. If this gets out, it'll set them back months." She looked at him. It just did. By dawn, she was already on the move again. She didn't rest, didn't pause. She passed the coordinates to Luc by noon. The message was transmitted to 4 cells by evening. By the next morning, the train routes were sabotaged. The villages were empty by the time the Germans arrived. Another 400 lives disappeared before the Nazis could take them. And again, no one knew Claire's name, only what she carried. And that was enough. By the spring of 1944, Claire Dubois had vanished completely from the official world. Her papers still read Mariette Landry. Her ration stamps were issued to a seamstress in Nevers, and her child, now nearly walking, answered only to the name Elliot. The resistance knew her real name, of course. But even within its highest ranks, it was spoken only when necessary, and never above a whisper. The Germans were losing ground. There were rumors of Allied landings in the west, bombings in the north, defections in the east. But in towns like Nevers, the danger hadn't faded. It had only grown more desperate. Occupiers who sensed the war slipping from their grasp became reckless, brutal, paranoid. Their patrols grew more erratic. Arrests became quicker. Trials became executions. Claire never flinched. In April, she intercepted her final message. It came through a refugee woman posing as a laundress, an envelope folded inside a cloth sack of baby clothes. The message was simple. Do not return. Your name is on a list. Execution order signed. There was no doubt about its origin. It was stamped with a false German insignia, a resistance method for confirming enemy document copies. Someone inside the ranks had flagged it. Claire Dubois was now officially marked for death. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She chose to disappear fully. That night she handed the last coded map to Luc. Give it to Jacques, she said. I'm done after this. Luc hesitated. You've earned rest, but the war isn't over. No, she agreed, but my part in it is. She took her son and left Nevers before sunrise, carrying only what she needed. No weapons, no codes, no thread. Just forged identity papers that named her a widow from Arles. She boarded a refugee convoy heading south, merged into the line of silent travelers, and never looked back. Claire Dubois was never seen again. Not by the Germans, not by her old neighbors, not even by the resistance. But her name lived on, not in records or medals, but in the memory of those she'd saved. Vallon was never raided again. The collaborators she exposed vanished from every registry. Fournier survived the war and opened another bakery in Lyon, often telling the story of a quiet mother with a sleeping baby and the sharpest mind she'd ever known. Adrien joined the Free French Forces at 17. Years later, when interviewed for a memoir on the resistance, he was asked who his greatest influence was. He replied, "A woman who used cloth and silence to save lives. She never carried a weapon, but every message she delivered hit harder than any bullet." Luc survived too, and after the war, he compiled a list, a private one, not for governments or museums, but for the children of survivors. He called it The Unnamed. Claire Dubois was the first name on it, and her son Elliot would grow up not knowing everything his mother had done, but feeling it deeply in the quiet strength she carried into every moment of their life together. He would learn later that his first act in the world was carrying a message that saved an entire village. Message no one saw, a name no one remembered, and a mother who never needed thanks. Because what mattered most to Claire wasn't recognition, it was that they lived. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more untold true stories of courage and quiet resistance. Your support keeps these voices alive. What would you risk to save a life during war if no one would ever know your name? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone.